October 1887. A widow with 11 days before the ground froze to iron. No husband, no fuel, no neighbor who'd meet her eyes, and a Dakota winter already sharpening itself on the wind. Her name was Eliza Hale, 34 years old. They'd thrown her off the home place with one trunk and a warning: be gone by the freeze. The whole settlement expected to find her dead by Christmas. What they did not expect was that the widow would simply vanish, and that by January the same men who'd put her out would be on their knees in the snow outside an empty cabin, begging it to tell them where she'd gone. But that was still 3 months away. Eliza's husband, Daniel, had been dead since the spring. A horse went over on him in the river crossing, and the water did the rest in under a minute, strong as a fence post on Monday, in the ground by Friday. And before the soil on his grave had even settled flat, his two brothers came up the road with a wagon and a folder of papers. The older one, Royce, did the talking. 40 years old, a man who never raised his voice because he had never once needed to. He laid the papers on her table the way an undertaker lays out his tools, and he explained slowly that the claim had been filed in their father's name. Daniel had only worked it. Eliza was a tenant of a dead man. No blood, no children, no standing under the law. 11 days, he said, until the agent came to record the transfer, and she'd want to be gone before then. The younger brother, Vern, didn't read papers. He walked through her kitchen like he was already measuring it for somebody else's wife, and when he passed her, he laughed. Short, private. Like the whole thing was a joke she hadn't been let in on yet. She didn't cry. She didn't argue. She just looked at the two of them, steady, until the looking made Vern stop laughing. That look should have warned them. By the next morning, Ember Creek had already decided how it would go. The widow Hale was being run off, and folks figured she'd crawl the 12 miles to town and kneel at the church for charity, or she'd freeze trying. A woman alone, 1 cow, a dozen hens, a leaning barn, and winter coming. Some pitied her. Most didn't. The Hale brothers made sure of the rest. Royce quietly cut off her wood from the family lot, all legal, all final, and Vern let it be known in town that anybody caught helping her would answer to him. They wanted the cold to do the work they were too cowardly to do themselves. And the cold was coming. The record in that country sat at 41 below. The last time winter showed its true face, 4 people had frozen, 2 of them inside their own houses. Folks still went quiet when the year came up. But Eliza Hale had something nobody in Ember Creek suspected. Her father had been a miner. 18 years underground in the Pennsylvania anthracite, 300 feet beneath daylight, in galleries that never saw a season. He had taught her something most people on the surface live their whole lives without ever learning, that the earth itself is a furnace. Go down far enough, 6 feet, 8 feet, and the ground holds a steady 55 degrees no matter what the sky's doing. Blizzard or heat wave, midnight or noon, the deep earth does not care. He'd told her that once, by a winter fire, when she was a girl. The ground remembers warmth, Eliza. It just holds it lower down than people think to look. She had never forgotten it. So she did not pack the wagon. She did not walk to town. On the second of those 11 days, with the brothers gone back to their own claims to wait her out, Eliza Hale picked up a spade and walked down to the cut bank along the creek, where the land dropped away and the brush grew thick enough to hide a person whole. And she began to dig. She had 9 days before the frost line came down and turned the soil to something a spade couldn't bite. 9 days to carve out either her grave or her salvation. And she knew, even then, that the line between those two things was thinner than she could afford to think about. Dig too shallow, and the cold would reach her. Dig the roof wrong, and the earth would come down on her in her sleep. Vent it wrong, and she wouldn't freeze at all. She'd simply not wake up, quiet, with the little fire still burning. The ground she was betting her life on could kill her 3 different ways before the weather ever got its turn. She worked in 2-hour shifts so she wouldn't collapse, 1 wooden bucket of earth at a time, 12 pounds a load, and she hauled every bucket deep into the brush and scattered it where no fresh dirt would show from the road. By the 3rd day, her palms had split, and the spade handle came up dark and wet after every shift. She wrapped her hands in strips of an old apron and kept going. She slept 4 hours a night with the mud still on her, because washing it off would have cost her time she did not have. And every time she crouched under the green oak beams she'd salvaged from the fallen section of fence, every time she heard the frozen brush tick and settle overhead, the same cold thought came up out of her stomach. If this comes down, no one will even know to look for me. 9 days. And in 9 days, alone, she carved a chamber 8 feet long, 6 wide, and 5 deep into the bank of the creek. Smooth walls, packed floor, oak set as crossbars overhead, then brush, then a foot of earth on top of that, until from 10 feet away, it was just another swell of ground above the water. She wasn't digging a hole. She was building a furnace inside the earth. The stove almost beat her, twice. Cast iron stove would have eaten 20 pounds of wood a night, and she didn't have 20 pounds of wood for the whole winter, not with the family lot close to her. So she built small. She walked the creek and gathered river stones the size of a man's fist, dense and smooth, the kind that drink heat slowly and give it back slower. She set them around a tiny clay firebox no bigger than a bread tin, mortared with creek clay and wood ash the way her father had shown her, and she ran a thin pipe of rolled tin up through a crack. She widened in the bank. That little box would burn sticks no thicker than her thumb, but it would heat 6 of those stones through to their centers, and 6 stones, wrapped in cloth, would hold the warmth of a sleeping body for 6 hours. 3 pounds of wood a night, where the whole valley was burning 20 and 30. She lined the floor with 8 inches of dry slow grass, then 3 wool blankets sewn out of Daniel's old coats, then the deer hide he'd tanned 2 summers back. She brought the cow down into the brush above the chamber and penned her there with loose boards, because 1,200 pounds of animal throws off heat all night long, and that heat would sink down through the earth like a slow second sun. She cut a trap door and hinged it with leather and latched it from the inside with a wooden peg. And on the 9th day, the first hard frost came down white and total, and Eliza Hale was already sleeping 6 feet inside the ground. The thermometer she'd nailed to a stake outside read 11 above. In her chamber, in the dark, it held at 54. Up in town, somebody saw thin smoke rising out of the brush along the creek and shook their head. Burning her last sticks, they said. Won't make Christmas. Nobody came to check. Then the real winter arrived, and it came for everyone. The 8th of December, 6 inches of wet snow overnight. The 14th, 12 below, wind tearing shingles off the roofs in town. The general store ran out of lamp oil. The blacksmith's water barrel split clean down the side. The 17th, 18 more inches in a day and a half, drifts to the windowsills, doors frozen shut from the outside. And then, the bottom fell out of it. 18 below, 23, 28. On the 20th of December, the stake thermometers in Ember Creek read 36 below zero, the coldest reading in 15 years, and the wind drove it down past 50. The stars looked like chips of broken glass. Families burned a month of firewood in 2 weeks. A man named Pruitt tried to cross the 70 feet from his porch to his barn to see to his horses, and his boy found him the next morning halfway, face down, the fingers of both hands frozen white. The doctor took 4 of them on Christmas Eve, on the kitchen table, with a bone saw. South of town, a fire went out in the night and did not get relit, and 2 children did not wake up. The ground was too hard for graves. The coffins waited in the church cellar for spring. And out along the creek, thin smoke kept rising from the brush, steady and unhurried, day after day, like something that knew exactly how long it intended to last. Otto Lindqvist was the first to understand. The carpenter. By the 23rd, he'd burned 2 chairs and a cabinet and could see his own breath in his own kitchen, and his wife's hands shook too hard to hold a cup, and he remembered the smoke. That woman has nothing, his wife said, and Otto said, slow. If she had nothing, the cow would be dead, and I saw that cow last week. So on Christmas morning, the Lindqvists walked 3 miles through knee-deep snow to a place the whole town had written off as a grave. They followed the smoke into the brush, and Otto nearly walked across the roof of the chamber before he understood he was standing on it. Then the trapdoor lifted at his feet, and Eliza Hale rose up out of the ground with a tin lantern in her hand, thinner than they remembered, smudged dark with soot, but not shivering, not frostbitten, her eyes clear and steady, taking in the trembling children, the wife shaking hands. "You're cold," she said. It wasn't a question. She brought them down into the earth. The little clay box glowed. The walls held the heat. The floor held it. The earth itself held it. The Lindqvist children stopped shaking for the first time in a week, and Otto's wife pressed her hands over her face and wept without making a sound. Eliza ladled hot water into tin cups. She softened hardtack for the little ones. She didn't lecture, and she didn't preach. When they finally climbed out 2 hours later, Otto turned at the trapdoor, his voice breaking, and said he'd remember this. She told him to tell no one. He couldn't keep it. By the 26th, 11 people had walked out to the creek. She took them down in shifts, warmed them by the box, sent them home with heated stones wrapped in cloth. And she showed them, quietly, patiently, how a person digs beneath the frost, how you vent a small fire, how the ground will keep you if you go to it instead of waiting for the sky to relent. Before I tell you who came up that creek next, if you've come this far with her, if these are the people you want more of, the ones who prepared while the world laughed, take 1 second and tap subscribe. Then let me finish it. And then, on the 28th, 2 men came up the creek who had no right to. Royce's hands were black at the fingertips. The law hadn't kept him warm. His big house with the big stone fireplace had burned through the furniture, the books, the kitchen table, and gone cold anyway. Vern's wife had taken the children to her sister's days before. Vern, who had laughed in her kitchen 5 weeks back, would not lift his eyes off the snow. They didn't knock. There was nothing to knock on. They stood on the roof of the chamber where the smoke came up, and they waited. Eliza lifted the trapdoor and looked at the 2 of them for a long, long moment, long enough that the silence filled up with every word they'd said. The papers on the table. Be gone by the freeze. The private little laugh. Then she stepped down off the ladder and to one side. They climbed down into the warm dark. They didn't apologize. They didn't explain. She gave them hot water and let them sit by the small fire they'd once been so sure she couldn't survive without. Royce stared at the smooth clay walls like a man reading a will that was not going his way. Vern didn't speak the whole 3 hours, and when they climbed out at last, Royce stopped at the top with his back to her and said, almost too quiet to hear, that he was sorry. Vern said nothing, but as he walked off through the snow, he looked back. Once, the cold broke on the 2nd of January. A newspaper man came down from Bismarck in February, sat in that chamber with a quiet woman, and listened to how she'd outlasted a winter that had broken stronger men and killed some of them. His piece ran under the line, the woman who went into the earth. The county clerk read it, heard the testimony of every family that had walked home from the creek alive, and under common law he recognized Eliza Hale's claim to the land. The brothers were quietly told by men they could not refuse to leave her be. They did. She stayed on that ground another 26 years, farmed it modestly, kept to herself, and died in her sleep in 1913, in a frame house she finally built with her own money, a stone's throw from the creek, where she'd once dug with bleeding hands to keep from being buried, when the county put a road through in 1931. The crew that came to clear the bank stopped working when their grader opened the old chamber. 40-some years on, the walls were still smooth and dry, the little clay box still black with soot, and the air down inside it still warmer than the air above. Her father had been right, all those years before, by a Pennsylvania fire. The ground remembers warmth. It just holds it lower down than people think to look. If you've ever made the hard, lonely choice that everyone around you called foolish, the heavy one, the expensive one, and you knew in your bones you were right, leave a comment and tell me what it was. And if you want more stories about the people who prepared, while everyone else was still laughing, the ones who understood something the crowd hadn't gotten around to yet, tap the red subscribe button right below this video. New stories every week.